to just say a quick thank you and turn it over to Little Shop of Stories, who is going to actually start off the event for us. So we have with us from Little Shop of Stories, Madison Hatfield, and I'm going to mute myself and say goodbye for a bit.
Yay, thank you, Mesa. Hi, I'm Madison. I'm a bookseller at Little Shop of Stories. We're an independent children's bookstore in Decatur, Georgia, right there in the Atlanta area. We are longtime, big-time fans of the Atlanta Science Festival, and every year it's such a joy to get to be a part of it. And we are especially thrilled to get to be involved in this special year and be a part of an event with Dr. Temple Grandin, someone that we've been a huge fan of for a long time. And so before I introduce her and our moderator, I wanted to say thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to those of you who have already pre-ordered the book from us. The Outdoor Scientist is an upcoming book from Dr. Grandin that we are really excited about. If you didn't get a chance to pre-order it through our Eventbrite link, I am putting the link to purchase from Little Shop of Stories there in the chat. So feel free to pre-order at any time. And we would be honored to get that book to you, whether you live in the Atlanta area or you're further afield. We can actually ship anywhere in the world. And I also wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping with y'all. Obviously, I've seen some of you guys here in the chat, an amazing place for you to tell us where you're tuning in from, to express your excitement, enthusiasm for things going on in the talk. But if you have a question for Dr. Grandin, there is a specific place that you need to put that so that our amazing moderator can actually see it. So if you have a question at any point during the program, you're going to go along the bottom of your screen and you'll see a button that says Q&A. When you click on that, you'll have the option to type in a question. And as we have time towards the end of the program, we'll ask some of the audience questions that you've provided. So again, the chat is awesome for talking to each other, expressing excitement, but we will lose your question if you try to put it there. So please put it in that Q&A box at any time during the program, and we will get to as many as we can as we have time. Now, the best part, you didn't come to hear me talk. You came here to hear some amazing scientists speak. So I want to start by introducing Cassandra Quave, who is our moderator tonight. She is an ethnobotanist, and she'll explain, I assume, what that is. But she's here at Emory University, right here, also in Decatur, Georgia. And she researches a lot of really cool stuff, but focusing on analyzing natural plant-based medicine of the Mediterranean indigenous cultures to help combat infectious disease and antibiotic resistance. Wow, wow, wow. Very cool stuff that I don't know a lot about, and I hope to learn more. And then Dr. Temple Grandin is our featured guest tonight. We're so thrilled to have you here. She's obviously an author. We're here for The Outdoor Scientist, her latest book. She's also a scientist and activist and a prominent proponent for the humane treatment of livestock. And she is a consultant for the livestock industry, as well as animal behavior and an autism spokesperson. So thank you both so much for being here. I'm going to turn my video off. Wherever you are in the world, please put your hands together for Cassandra Quave and Temple Grandin.
Yay! Well, it's great to be here. First of all, I think I might just show you a copy of the book, The Outdoor Scientist. I'm professor of animal science at Colorado State. I think I'll start out and read a short passage. And I'm going to read the passage where I talk about an assignment I had in college on how to study animal behavior. And you had to pick out an animal, and it was pretty much at the zoo where I, did this. So I had to find an animal at the zoo that, had a more natural enclosure and I could see some behavior. And I had to watch 3 hours worth of behavior. And that's what's called an ethogram. And then I'll read a little bit about doing that with cattle behavior. One of my first assignments in animal behavior was to choose an animal and observe it it was 4 hours actually. When an animal scientist studies animals, they use something called an ethogram. An ethogram is a catalog of all the observable animal behaviors. The behaviors the animal does itself, frequency of the behaviors, what is the behavior. I decided to go to the zoo and observe the antelope from my ethogram. I parked myself in one place and wrote down all the behaviors I observed: sleeping, resting, pooping, peeing, walking around, and then how frequent were those behaviors. The shocker came a few hours later. when two males in adjacent pens actually put their horns through chain link fence in between the pens, and they sparred with their horns through the fence. I didn't have that behavior written down. I didn't expect it. The aggressive behavior was, move for dominance. Animals fight by locking their horns. Even though they were kept apart, they no longer lived in the wild. Their instinct to fight still persisted. I had only observed the antelope for an hour or two. I would have missed this horn behavior through the fence. So I'm going to add a few extra words. So when you're doing an ethogram, you have to figure out how long should you do it, because I would have missed that behavior. You have to be patient. I made observations in Arizona feedlots that also contributed to my becoming an animal scientist and developing safer cattle handling systems. I looked at what cattle were seeing. I was able to see reflections on shiny metal or other visual distractions that made the cow afraid or unwilling to enter a chute. I looked at what they were seeing. Now, when I first did these things, I didn't know I was an extreme visual thinker, where everything I think about is a picture. And science has now shown that there's visual thinkers like me called object visualizers, often really good at art, working with animals, and also good with mechanical things. There is the mathematical minds, more the pattern thinkers, the computer programmers, and then there are the people who are verbal. And the different kinds of minds can work together in really wonderful ways. I want to just talk about a few other things about outdoor scientists before we go into the questions. You can see I'm a child of the 50s, and mom would say, go outside and play. And a lot of the things in the book I did as a kid. And in the first chapter, I described collecting rocks. My sister and I were in the big rock collections. This is probably like at about 8 years of age. And we'd go find rocks and we'd bust them open to see what they look like inside. And you must wear safety goggles to do this. You absolutely must. And you see pretty colors inside the rocks. And I had one shelf in the tool shed, and she had another shelf in the tool shed. And it was labeled my rock collection and her rock collection. And we just had a great time doing that. And then in the summer, we were on the beach, so I'd collect shells and make mosaics and artwork out of them. Then I'd take this really thin, filmy seaweed, and you could suspend it in water and put a piece of cardboard under it and raise it up like this, and it would stick to the cardboard, make a seaweed art. And then I loved to make sand castles, dribbling sand through my hands. There's a picture of me and my sister doing that. Then I remember when we made a tent out in the woods out of bed sheets. So one of the projects is to make a tent out in the woods. We need to get kids out doing things. And as a real little kid, when I was about maybe 5, I used to take buds apart on plants to look at how they developed. And that's in there. Birding, that's another thing. We had bird feeders. That'd be a great activity, get kids counting birds. And there are some citizen science projects where children and teenagers and adults can collect data for actual scientists. And then looking at the sky. I mean, I was the child of the Sputnik era. And I can remember going over to the next door neighbor's house and trying to watch for Sputnik. And everybody was out there and all we saw was airplanes. But there are some websites in Outdoor Scientist where you can look up on NASA websites and find out when space station may circle overhead. And that's a lot easier to see. Now, there's an interesting animal ethogram that's unfortunately not in the book because I saw it after it got sent to the printers. But I've had people say to me, well, there's just no way that kids in the city could do this. I go, yes, there is. Okay, right where I live in like a townhouse, about 15 feet from my door, I sat and I watched a squirrel burying a nut. Very interesting. Watch the whole behavior. He'd have the nut in his mouth and he'd dig like this and dig. Then he tried it and the hole was too shallow. So he put it back in his mouth so somebody couldn't steal it. And he dug some more, tried it again. And on the third time, he got it deep enough and he covered it. So you're looking at the behaviors here. I've got digging behavior. I've got holding it in his mouth. I've got putting the nut in and trying the depth. Then, and there's quite a few different behaviors there. And in the city, there's lots of pigeons. We have a lot of wildlife at the Denver airport, bunnies in the parking lot, pigeons in the parking garage. There's a lot more things to watch. I'm working on another project now on visual thinking, and I was reading about a really innovative teacher who took her city kids out on a field trip of learning about parking meters and learning words like parking violation and time. Okay, that's just something there in the neighborhood. There's more things to do in the neighborhood than what you might think might be available to do. And we've got to get the kids off the screens. I'm saying problems, especially with kids that have got a special ed label like autism or dyslexia, just getting addicted to video games. And they're not going on into great jobs in the video game industry. If they were, I wouldn't be criticizing it. But I found a lot of these things were fun, and I think a lot of kids are going to find this stuff is really fun. There's also profiles of famous scientists that worked on different things. In some of them, there's one lady that worked on fossils, and she, the male scientists were horrible to her. They went and took credit for all her stuff. It was terrible for all the stuff she discovered. It was not very nice. Well, what I'd like to do now, and if we're in a real bookstore, is I would just open it up for questions. But I want to see kids getting out and doing things. And then, of course, there's the Calling All Minds book I did several years ago. And that has my aviation projects in it, little kites and parachutes. And I had to tinker to get them to work. A lot of kids today are too afraid to make a mistake. Well, I had to tinker with this kite. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. I figured out how to make coat hanger crossbars on my parachute so it would open easier. And then I was looking up things on Google Patents and found that, a jillion years later, somebody patented something sort of like that. But tinkering, something that kids don't do today.
That's great, Temple. We have a question from the audience.
Okay.
There's one that says, what are some examples of observable animal behaviors that kids can note?
Well, you could watch, squirrels are really interesting to watch. Okay, like we have a lot of them right here on, right where I live, and I've seen them go out across electric wires. The thing with burying the nut, that was right by my front door. We got some bunnies. And if you just sit really quietly, you can watch what they do. In the cities, you got pigeons, watch them. And if you come back each day to a certain place, you probably see certain pigeons that you'll recognize. And they have little routines. But it's stuff where you're going to have to watch it and be observant. My professor assigned me to 4 hours to watch animal behavior. Now, if I'd only watched for 2 hours, I wouldn't have seen the behavior where the male antelopes put their horns through the fence, which was kind of striking. You see, there's some behaviors that are really important, but they don't happen that often. That's why you have to make sure when you're doing an ethogram that you do it for a longer time. Like we had a cat that just liked to sleep in a warm spot. In the late afternoon, I'd watch him for 2 hours. He would have seen nothing but sleeping. Got a lot more active at night.
That's great.
And get out and observe things.
That's great.
Well, one thing I wrote up in Outdoor Scientist, I was out at our experiment station, and I stand too long, my leg hurts, so I sat on the catwalk on the cattle handling facility, and there was a little patch of weeds about at the size of a desk. It was maybe 2:30 in the afternoon, so I was just watching that, and little white butterflies came into the morning glories, there were bees on it, and then all of a sudden, the morning glories closed, and all the butterflies and stuff went away. So I only would have seen that when I was there at that particular time, but just something like a patch of weeds. And I was working on the book, and so I kind of turned that into a little field trip for the book.
That's great. Do you think it's valuable to revisit the same plants or the same spot in nature over a series of days?
Yes, sometimes that's really valuable, because then you can see patterns that animals have, that patterns that animals do. Also got, some simple bird feeder designs. Find out certain birds will come back. When I was a child, a robin nested in a tree right by the living room window, and mother explained, don't disturb it. And we watched the little, she had her chicks and she was feeding them, and mother said, don't open the window. We would just watch her really carefully, and watched her setting on her eggs, and it was right by the bird feeder. And that was something
great.
that we saw.
we have a lot of questions now. I'm going to jump into some of these.
Okay, good.
Yeah. Uh, well, here's one is what is the target age range for the outdoor scientist?
Elementary school up through middle school probably would be about the age range. But even adults, I mean, I found when I was researching this book, when I sat out there and looked at that patch of weeds, I was amazed at what I could see when I just sat there for over an hour and looked at it. And I happened to be there at just the right time in the afternoon to see it.
That's great. That's great.
But there's stuff all over the place to look at.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And I really love how in your book you have some very clear instructions on projects with
Yes.
simple materials that children can take advantage of at home or just in their environment to make these observations and perform these experiments. What's your favorite project in the book?
Well, I was really into my rock collection. I was really into making mosaics. I made a turtle mosaic when I was a child from shells I found on the beach. Now, I know you can buy shells at craft stores, but you could find other things outside. And we were taught about poison ivy. You don't want to get into that. I can remember in the summer, there was just one big patch of poison ivy. We never went in there. We knew what that was and knew to stay away from it.
That's great.
But now there's a section in there where I talk about, some of the pollution getting onto the beach. And there was an interesting accident where a container fell off a container ship, a great big truck-sized container. It's full of little rubber duckies, and they floated all around the world. And they got people, and they charted currents based on where the rubber duckies went. And that was sort of an accidental experiment, but they actually got some scientific data off of it.
That's really interesting. That ties into another question we have from one of our guests is named Robin, and they ask, can you explain how your visual processing may have helped your studies?
Well, I don't think in words. And when I was young, I thought everybody thought in pictures. All through my 20s, I didn't know that other people did not think in pictures. It was kind of a shocker for me. A shocker to learn that other people just didn't do that. And I can do a little thing with some paper here. If you say something to me like, think about a church steeple, I see specific ones. Now, most people, if I ask them about their own dog or their own car, they'll see that. But I ask you about something you don't own, then the verbal thinker will get a much more vague image. And I'll never forget when I asked the speech therapist, I was on an autism conference, to think about church steeples, and that's all she got. Just the vaguest thing like this, where a person who tends to be a very big visual thinker, they'll name them. They'll start naming where they're at because it's bottom up. Specific examples make the category of the church steeple.
That's great.
And it's something that's out there in the environment. You don't own them. Most people don't pay much attention to them, but they're there. And if you ask, think about your office or something like that, usually most people can see that because you're so familiar with it. But there's some people even that have aphantasia, and they can be good at mathematics. And aphantasia is a person that has no visual thinking at all. In other words, if you say, think about your own pet, when it's not there, they don't see it. But that's kind of rare. Most people are mixtures of the kind of thinking, but the different kinds of thinking can be complementary. We're using Zoom right now, very easy to use. A person like me is going to make the interface. The mathematicians have to do the programming to make it work. So you need to have both. And the reason why Zoom became so popular, ease of use. That simple.
That's great. Well, here's a question that ties into that, this idea of experimentation and design. And this one is, what are some ways to teach kids perseverance? Experiments require trial and error. And how do you keep trying things instead of just giving up?
Well, this is a real problem now. And I think it goes back to schools taking practical hands-on things out of the schools. When I was in elementary school, we had sewing. I'd learned embroidery in 3rd grade. I had a toy sewing machine, actually sewed in 4th grade. I did woodworking in 5th grade. I was really into art. You do hands-on things, you're going to make mistakes. I think part of this is a lack of having hands-on things to do. Because I had a teacher ask me, like in Calling All Minds, one of the projects is a paper snowflake, where you cut out a paper snowflake. And I held it up. And I had a teacher say to me, well, what's going to happen to the kid's self-esteem if they cut it wrong and it fell apart? Well, you make another one. And maybe you look it up on YouTube and find out how to make it. But when I did a book signing for Calling All Minds, this is about 3 years ago now, I found out about 20 to 30% of elementary school children outside of Denver, Colorado, had never made a paper airplane. And they made the first paper airplanes, and they loved chucking them off the balcony in this big theater that we were in. So the projects range from very simple things like that to, like putting a sheet over a rope is in the outdoor science. It's really simple, to more complicated projects. But we have kids today totally removed from the world of the practical. In my livestock class, they have to do a scale drawing. And I've been doing this class now for over 30 years. And in the last 10 years, last 5 years, they've been having a harder and harder time. This is college students with doing this drawing. And I had a student in the class this year who had never used a ruler to measure anything. Never had measured anything. And they're not doing rulers and protractors in math. I think some of the stuff they're doing in some of the math in elementary schools is kind of crazy. What happened about finding the area of a circle and finding the, figuring out how many floor tiles you'd need for a certain room, just practical, kind of math. But I think some of this lack of grit is not doing practical things. There's an interesting experiment done by a lady named Kelly Lambert at the University of Richmond. And she has 2 sets of just regular white laboratory rats, just regular rats. And one set of rats live in a big enclosure, and they hide Fruit Loops, a really sugar-laden cereal that rats love, and they bury the Fruit Loops in sawdust. They have to dig for it. Mm-hmm. The other group of rats, they just throw it in on the floor, free-handed. And the thing that's interesting is when you take these 2 groups of rats, the ones that have to dig a bit, little challenge to get their Fruit Loops, versus the ones where it's just chucked on the floor, you give them an impossible problem to solve, like how to get Fruit Loops out of a weird cat toy they can't open. The rats that had the Fruit Loops buried had more perseverance. They would spend more time trying to get this thing open than the rats that just had it thrown on the floor. And I think some of this gets back to not figuring things out. I can remember as a child, we had to sleep out in an old army tent. I was maybe 11, and the other neighbor's kid was like 6 months older. And the grown-ups didn't come out and help us put it up. It was all saggy. They just let us, as long as we didn't do anything really dangerous, they kept an eye on it. They let us figure out how to put up an old army tent. And there was missing a bar that would have kept it straighter.
That's great.
Sometimes there's just not enough, doing things. Like, I don't see kids in my neighborhood here outside hardly at all. We got a big field right next between where I live and the school. Boy, in my generation, that would have been full of kids flying kites and everything else. Looking at insects and all kinds of stuff, playing with the grass. We'd like take a blade of grass and go like this, and it would whistle. Mm-hmm. Just simple stuff like that.
That's great. Well, this ties into another question. This one comes from Sarah, and she asks, do you have suggestions on how we can encourage administrators and other policymakers to adopt these hands-on experiences in outdoor activities? It would bridge many disciplines to do this: observing, testing, tinkering, and even writing about it and applying social studies. Research like yours and Richard Louv suggests that kids need to be outside.
I would agree with Richard Louv, Last Child in the Woods, great book.
Yes.
I would totally agree with that. And we can teach practical math along with some of the things that projects. You can teach writing, reading, you can write about it, read about it. Other thing I've noticed in college students, writing skills in the last 5 or 6 years are just atrocious. Mm-hmm. I ask the students, smart students, I don't blame the students for this. They've never written a book report where they have to summarize a book. That's an important skill. And they haven't written term papers where the teacher would mark up and copy edit the work and correct the grammar. Mm-hmm. And I'm finding in the last 5 or 6 years that I have to correct grammar now on graduate student papers. And I'm going, what are you learning in school? Writing. When I look back at all the different things that where when I started out, I designed a cattle handling facility, and then I'd write about it. And there's teachers doing innovative things, and they need to be written up in the professional literature, but also just written up in much more general things. Put videos up on YouTube of innovative teaching stuff. But just plain writing. I mean, so somebody just wrote in the chat, you're the 5th professor I've heard says that writing skills are horrible. And I've talked to a lot of professors. Let's learn some skills, like just how to write clearly. And I was an author. When I, in 9th grade, my writing skills were better than a lot of adults today, a lot of college students today. And I'm finding out that they never had the grammar corrected. They said it might be bad for self-esteem. Well, it taught me how to write. And I find on students now, graduate students, I have to correct grammar now on half of it. And I've taken their writing from atrocious to usable. I'm not going to say they're great writers, but I've taught them some things about writing. And I'm very concerned, this is getting into other things, I'm very concerned about loss of skills. We no longer in this country build the state-of-the-art electronic chip making machine. I'm talking like chips in your phone, electronic chips. It's based on physics research done in the US, but it's from Holland. And I read this article in The Economist magazine. I think the title of the story was Industrial Light Magic. And they had a picture of this machine with all the covers off, and a lot of skilled trades were involved in it. We tend to stick our nose up at skilled trades. We have electrical infrastructure falling apart, wires in California falling down and burning things up if the wind gets over 40 miles an hour. Texas, everything froze. 4 different types of power plants froze. I think some of this gets back to kind of sticking the nose up at the skilled trades. And the skilled trades, like mind I have, I can't do algebra, never have, managed to get through college and didn't have to take it because it wasn't required when I went to college. And I'm concerned we're screening kids out that we need to do what I call the clever engineering department. I did a talk just before COVID with the patent office, and they had old models. See, when the patent office first started, you had to make a model of your invention. Well, all the inventions when the patent office started were mechanical devices. You couldn't patent business stuff. And you had to make models. You see, that would be my kind of thinking. And we're losing that skill. We don't have people to fix factories. I've been in a state-of-the-art poultry processing plant. All the equipment came from Holland. We built a building, refrigeration, boilers, we did that. But all the clever things that go inside, we're not doing. I'm very concerned about losing skills. When I was out working with these large, big meat plants, we're putting up big, complicated factories. I worked with welders, machinery designers, people that had 20 patents, people that own their own businesses. I'm going to guess about 20% of them would be autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD. The special ed department builds the stuff. And then you say, oh, we can't let this kid use tools because he's autistic. Well, autism is a very big spectrum going from Silicon Valley, that's your mathematics. The mathematical autistic kid runs tech industry. The visual thinking, ADHD, dyslexic, autistic kid is the mechanic and more the skilled trade sides of things. And so you need all the different skills. And these were big, complicated things. I was walking around the whole entire site, not just my own stuff. And now we've got electrical stuff falling apart and having all these problems. Well, then the other thing, you get the money, people want to save money. Well, you didn't have a visual thinker on the board to say, hey, if you don't insulate this water turbine system, this plant's going to freeze. And it won't make any power.
That's a great point. Here's another question for you, Dr. Grandin, and it is, have you ever had an idea for an invention while observing your?
Well, there's actually a lot of interesting things I've read about that. And there's a lot of things they're doing in mechanical engineering right now, material science. I'm looking at a lot of different things in nature, like how insects fly. I read an interesting article, and I don't have it with me right now, about how plants evolved more efficient veins to get fluids and nutrients to the leaves. And a primitive plant like the ginkgo just has straight lines. Now, if you damage the leaf, there's no other route. And if you look at other more modern plants, they have a kind of a circuitous route where if you tear the leaf, it can still get nutrients. And I'm really interested in things with supply chain management. Big, it's fragile. You know, we have a storm, it knocks something out. Well, we have very narrow supply chains for things like certain pharmaceuticals, like antibiotics, for example. And you have a big centralized supply chain that makes food really cheap. But when you have a storm or you have COVID shutting things down, then you find out big is fragile. Now, if you have a more distributed supply chain, it's going to make the food more expensive. But if you have a flood or a storm or COVID or some other problem, you have other suppliers. Now, it takes more energy for the plant to make these different, more circuitous routes. But then if an insect eats that leaf, that plant, it's more robust. That also applies to supply chains for all kinds of products, because networks form hubs. Well, I think this is really interesting. I look at how, Facebook networks form hubs. And then you look at airport maps. I'm old enough to remember before the airlines had hubs. It was all point-to-point flights, and they form hubs. Now, it's very efficient when you do that, but you have a gigantic snowstorm come in and mess up one of the airports, it makes a problem throughout the whole system. So the more distributed supply chain is more robust. And I don't remember the name of the scientist. I think I read this in the Wall Street Journal pretty recently. But I thought that's really interesting, because nature learned that it's better to make the more robust leaf where you have to grow more channels to get the water and nutrients to it. And where the ginkgo, if you tear the leaf, that whole part of the leaf is gone because it just has straight channels.
That's great. There's so much we can learn from making these careful observations of nature. And I really love this perspective on getting kids out in nature more. And there are a few questions from the audience that are linked to this concept. I'm going to try and lump them into one. And
okay,
it really comes down to, what is your ideal vision of a school for children, and including aspects that would be, well adapted for children with autism?
Well, and autism is a very big spectrum. You see, when I was 3 years old, I looked really severe. And you work with the little kids, some of them, you get them talking, but you're going from someone who's slightly geeky and nerdy to somebody that maybe can't dress themselves and they have epilepsy and other medical problems on top of the autism. It's such a big spectrum. I went to a small normal school in a regular classroom. My mother and the teachers worked together. There's a lot of things we did right in school in the 50s. We had all these hands-on things. Teachers marked up my work, because I don't know what the learning in school, but these students can't write. And I consider that a really important basic skill. And the reason why I think the book report's important, and I had to write a bunch of them, is it teaches you how to summarize. Then you have to critique the book, but you also have to do an accurate job of summarizing what the book is about in a fairly short article. That teaches important skills. I can't believe some of the rubbish that people believe these days. And I think some of that, again, gets back from being too far away from the practical world. So how can you believe some of this nonsense?
Wow. Well, we have some other questions about, well, number one is, what other books have you written? And do you have any other books in the works?
Well, I'm working right now on a book on visual thinking, because I'm very concerned what's called the object visualizers in this research. I have an earlier book, The Autistic Brain, and that was published in 2013. And I discussed some of the research on what's called object visualization and then visual spatial, which is the more mathematical. They are different things. Now, the problem is a lot of studies mix the two together, but things like the alpha requirement is screening out the object visualizers. We're the one, nobody was up in that conference room in Texas a long time ago saying, hey, you're going to have to insulate this turbine system or it's going to freeze. we have a similar type of power plant, and we had 2 feet of snow on it. It still worked. We had trees storm knocked over a pile of trees. They had local power outages, but the plant still kept cranking them out. It's winterized. See, that's the sort of thing where you need a visual thinker to say, hey, this is not going to work. Think Fukushima. I couldn't believe why that happened. I had to really dig. I dug into a lot of stuff. I looked at a lot of stuff online. I read a lot of newspapers on the plane. And it happened for a simple reason. It's so simple. I can't believe it. Engineers calculate risk. It's not a very good idea when you live next to the sea, but it's super important. Electrically driven emergency cooling pump in a non-waterproof basement. You see, I saw the water going in there. And all I need to know about that reactor is when I need that pump, it better run. Well, the pump didn't run when it was needed. That's simple. And you see, what I've learned is the more mathematical mind doesn't see it. So you've got the object visualizer, and you can actually look up research on this. Then you have the visual spatial, which is more mathematical. They're 2 different things. And lots of studies mix them together, which is wrong. But we need our object visualizers. And algebra is a mystery to me. This doesn't make any sense. But you see, you need the skilled tradespeople to make the mechanical parts on the electronic chip making machine that we don't make. The other thing is small companies innovate. I don't care if it's in agriculture or it's in electronic chips, even the vaccines. It's Pfizer BioNTech. BioNTech invented. Thank you, Pfizer, for paying for it.
That's great.
But the little guy invented it.
That's great. Well, here's another question for you, Dr. Grandin. This has to do with the topic of women in science. When you graduated from your field of science, were there many women, and did you see professors trying to encourage women to pursue science? And how?
When I started in the 70s, there were no women in animal science. We had a dairy farm in our school. I had to use a men's bathroom. I had to knock on the door, make sure they weren't in there. Being a woman in the early 70s was a much bigger barrier. I had to make myself twice as good. I had to be twice as good as a guy. Now I also saw back doors to things. We got to figure out back doors to jobs. Half of all good jobs are backdoor. And there's a scene in the HBO movie, Temple Grandin, where I go up and I get the card from the editor of our state farm magazine. Because I knew if I wrote for that magazine, that really helped my career. And this is where the writing skills, couldn't do algebra. My writing was decent. And I wrote good articles for that magazine, and I got respect for that. That when I covered that cattle feeders meeting, I summarized the talks accurately. Let's go back to book reports again. Got to summarize the main speeches at the meetings, summarize accurately. I did that. And where I had the most discrimination was not the owners of the places, not the guys in the field. It was the foremans, middle management. Almost all of my trouble was middle management. I had owners of feed yards that were very good to me. And then I had a former Marine Corps captain seek me out who was starting a small construction company. He put together a real diverse set of people. I got along well with military. There was also another person who was a superintendent of the local Swift plant. I found out he was military when I read his obituary. It's sort of no nonsense. There was 2 ex-military people that were very helpful to me when I was getting started in my career.
That's great.
Yeah, but they, now I was, there's discrimination. Some of the discrimination is terrible. It's still going on. And you just look at some of the figures. Resume studies, hideous. You change the name, girl's name, some other kind of name, and they get less job offers.
Yeah.
And
do you think things will change, Temple? Do you think that things are improving?
Yeah, I think things are improving, and things are improving. They've got to change, but I think we got to, one thing I had to do, and someone that gets discriminated against, they have to prove that I had to do twice as good as a guy. I can't believe some of the mistakes guys made on jobs. They still have jobs. Like a $20 million mistake.
Ooh.
Build a factory without enough wastewater treatment. They were told they didn't have enough wastewater treatment. They did it anyway, and it closed. Whoops. Oh, a woman would have been fired instantly. This guy still had a job after this big mistake. Got to be kidding.
Well, here's a lighter question. We've gotten a number of questions in the Q&A about pets. Do you have any pets now? And what was your first pet?
Well, we had dogs as a child, and in the 50s, dogs all ran loose. And we didn't have a lot of the behavior problems we had now. We have more fear of thunderstorms and things like that, and dogs afraid of the vet. And I think part of the problem is they don't get exposed to enough things. So they're scared of everything. There was an interesting study done in the UK, which unfortunately the student never published. But this veterinary student looked at indoor cats versus outdoor cats and which ones are more likely to scratch and bite the vet. It was the indoor cats. Well, I think the indoor cat might have seen her first dog at a vet clinic. And that would be really scary.
Oh, that ties into another question. Can you learn as much from pet behavior as that of wild animal behavior, or are domesticated animals too influenced by human action?
Well, there's an author named Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, and she's written up in here, The Hidden Life of Dogs. And
Great.
these were dogs that were free roaming dogs, and she followed them to find out what they'd do. And she watched things like how they'd wait for the traffic and crossing the street. And that was an ethogram. Yeah, and then cats, when they get outside, we're going to see plenty of behavior. And we've got to make sure we're not killing birds.
Yeah.
And I just read an interesting study that one of the ways to prevent that is to play a lot of prey chasing games of things like a feather wand to kind of satisfy some of that urge.
That's great.
And when we were doing the bird feeder stuff when I was little, we did not have a cat at that time. We had a dog. Because a cat would have been killing the birds.
Well, do you ever see different behaviors in two animals that are actually of the same species?
Oh, yes, you get personality. And I did some of the first research in cattle where I looked at temperament. And you can have cattle of the same breed, like Hereford or Angus. And some animals get scared more easily than others. That's personality. And the thing that's interesting in the scientific literature, in the last few years, in animals is starting to use the words personality. And animals definitely have emotions. You can have fear, you can have anger, then you have separation distress. Like get the mom and the baby get separated, or one sheep is separated from the other sheep, that's separation distress. Then you have seek. One dog likes to chase the ball, the other dog could care less about the ball. That's a difference in the seek trait. Then you have a sex drive, of course, mother young nurturing, and you play. Now, one of the problems we've got in the literature, and I've been going to be reviewing some of that, is terminology. Lots of different kinds of terminology. And looking at the same thing and calling it different things is a big problem. But the word personality now is getting into the animal literature. And yes, you have individual differences. And there's some individual differences in just how the nervous system forms that genetics doesn't control. I remember looking at brain scans when MRI scanning first started in the 80s. I found these brain scans of identical twins right through here. And you look at the structures of the brain, very similar. A pair of identical twins would be more similar than fraternal twins. So they had two pairs of identical twins, and you looked at these scans and it was obvious just looking at them. They're very similar between the identical twins, but 5 to 10% difference in just the shape of some of the structures.
Wow.
You didn't need an MD to see it. And it was a picture I found in a magazine, in a science magazine in the late 80s.
Well, here's a question that tails into animal personality, and it's are there ways to help dogs or other pets heal from grief or loss?
Well, yes, and there's a lot of rescue animals where you don't know what was done to them, and if an animal has an initial experience that's really scary and bad, then they may be afraid of that person. You can get fear memories. And I wrote about that years ago with Katherine Johnson in Animals in Translation. And there was a horse that was terrified of black cowboy hats. He'd been abused by a guy wearing a black cowboy hat. White cowboy hat was fine. Black cowboy hat was scary. Or at the veterinarian's office, should the vet wear a white coat? Well, if they've done really good veterinary stuff, fear free, where you feed the dog treats, give him a non-slip mat to stand on, he may be looking forward to going to the vet because you get such good treats. Where first experience with the vet's really scary, a bunch of people just grabbing you, then you're going to be afraid of the vet. So the white coat could either be associated good or it could be associated bad. The animal tends to, when animals get afraid of stuff, it's most often something they see that's obvious, like a white coat. There was a bull in Australia, and any Jeep-like Land Rover type vehicle, he just flipped them. They look
Wow.
bad. He just flipped them. Anything that had that kind of shape. Now, a sedan or a bigger truck, he wouldn't mess with that.
Wow.
And sedans, he didn't go after.
Wow. Well, here's a nice question. This is from Peyton. And Peyton writes, as someone who is an aspiring 7th grade scientist and also autistic, what is one piece of encouragement or advice that you can share?
Well, I would get out and do a lot of scientific things. People ask me how I got involved in the cattle industry. I was exposed to it as a teenager. And if you watch the HBO movie, I got fascinated by an optical illusion room. In fact, my teacher wasn't going to show me how to make that. He wanted me to figure it out for myself. See, this gets back to, having, some perseverance. But get kids doing a lot of different things. Okay, you go to college, then I'd recommend doing different internships, because it's also important to find out something you hate too. There's been a lot of parents where they force their kid to become a doctor and they don't like being a doctor. I was reading about, we're working on the book on visual thinking, and Betsy, my co-author, found a great article about a teacher who would just she'd take her kids exploring in the subway and they'd learn about stuff. I'd show them an emergency room in the hospital when it's not busy. Just showing them stuff in the neighborhood that's interesting stuff. I think one of the big problems today is kids don't get exposed to enough stuff to figure out what they might be interested in. You see, and that's another reason for doing a lot of hands-on things. My art ability showed up when I was in 3rd grade. Mother encouraged it. And I would just do the same horse head over and over again. And she encouraged me to draw lots of things. She encouraged me to use different medias, paint, pencil, pens, just different things.
That's great. Here's another question about science activities. This one's from Vanessa, and it is, what science activities would you recommend for children who are on the autism spectrum disorder and experience sensory aversions? Do you have any recommendations?
Well, I remember they did a really loud science experiment in my school, and I just stepped outside. The other thing is, that's when you put the headphones on. The thing with the autistic kids, no surprises. You don't want to have surprises. And sometimes it's things that make loud noises. And one of the ways to help an autistic kid get over that is let them control the thing that makes the noise. There was an autistic kid terrified of the buzzer on the scoreboard down in the gym. So they took him down there when no one was there and just let him keep hitting the switch where he controlled it. And then he started playing tunes on it.
That's
where
great.
that can help. But mainly you do a lot of the same things you do with the other kids. Sudden loud noise can be a problem. And so you might suggest that the kid put the headphones on.
That's
Okay,
great.
that's simple. I always like to figure out simple things. And in Outdoor Scientists, there's websites for citizen science projects. But I remember when like in my school, we had this scuzzy pond. We go down and catch tadpoles and grow them in the classroom. Kids just aren't doing enough of that stuff. And these are things that are not expensive, not hard to do. Grow some plants in the classroom. Those are simple things to do. And this teacher was just really resourceful, finding things in the city and teaching math about parking tickets. Well, 3rd graders thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's great. Here's a question from Frank and Heather, and they ask, what moved you to become an advocate for those with autism?
Well, I was originally working on my business and then gradually I got invited to do some meetings. And I want people, I want people in the autism community to always know I'm a professor, a scientist, And because I can see some kids getting so much in the autism box, their parents aren't taking them shopping. They're not learning basic things like that. And I think it's important to show what we can do. This is something I've always done. People thought it was weird, but when I first started my business, my idea of an interview was to show off the drawings. There's my drawings right there.
Oh, they're beautiful.
And they're in Thinking in Pictures. And I would just show off my drawings.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, show the work. And then the other thing is learning some work skills, being on time. Because I've had a lot of granddads walk up to me and they find out they're on the autism spectrum when the kids get diagnosed. Computer scientists, accountants, NASA engineer.
Mm-hmm.
And then he told me about everybody in the control room he thought was on the spectrum. Well, I saw some reviews of a book about the space program where it was from one of the controllers. And I don't know, he went through the whole book and wrote things like, it's the flight deck, not the cockpit. It's propellant, it's not fuel. Went through the whole book, picking it apart like that. And I go, only somebody on the spectrum would do that. I was just laughing when I read that. He said, I worked in the control room when the rocket going to the moon.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, here's another question, and I'm curious about this too, because you've become such a visible and vocal advocate for both science and children with autism. And this question is, what was it like to be a part of making a movie about your life?
Well, it was really interesting. Claire Danes kind of became me. I gave her old ancient VHS tapes I could find, and she practiced and practiced. It was like going into a weird time machine of the 60s and 70s. They did a beautiful job on their 60s and 70s authenticity. And I said, remember, no Nike type shoes. Those didn't exist then. No backpacks that time.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to be really authentic, and they were. The thing I really liked about the movie, it shows visual thinking absolutely accurate. That's important. You want to understand visual thinking? The way I think you can watch that movie. And then here Margaret's talking about that she had some urban kids really fascinated by what cockroaches do. Well, you can do an ethogram on cockroaches.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up, I think we have one last question. That would be, what is it that you hope that the young readers will walk away understanding after reading The Outdoor Scientist?
Well, I hope they get out and just start observing things, because in order for science to form a hypothesis, you've got to have an observation first. Observation is a very important part of science. We have some very expensive science like the Hubble Space Telescope. It observes things. It's not a controlled experiment. You observe and you see what you can see. Observation is an extremely important part of science, and if that can just get kids interested, it's a big world out there and a lot of things to look at. That's right in your backyard, or pigeons in the park, or watch what they do. Pick out what's called a focal animal. Maybe there's a particular pigeon where he's really easy to recognize and he comes back. He's your focal animal. That's an official scientific term for a particular animal you watch to learn about behaviors.
It's fantastic. I have an 8-year-old son that is doing remote school right now during COVID, and I think we are definitely going to try and put some of these tips into practice tomorrow and see what animals we can observe and create our own ethogram. That'll be really great.
There's more stuff than there's a lot of stuff right there.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I started working on the book on Outdoor Scientist, I started just looking at patches of ground. Like we have Canada geese here that don't migrate. They think they own the roads. They walk really slowly across them. They're interesting to watch. And then I had a reporter ask me, well, there's nothing for the kids to look at in the city. I go, yes, there is. There's lots of stuff to look at.
Absolutely. And here in Atlanta, it's beautiful springtime. So we have lots of flowers in bloom and lots of pollinators are out and about. plenty of squirrels to observe, I think, too.
Squirrels are really interesting to observe, and this thing with them burying a nut. Of course, it was the right season. It was interesting how he dug his hole. He'd try it. It wasn't deep enough, and then he'd work on digging it again, and then he finally got it deep enough.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Grandin, for speaking with us today. This has been an enlightening conversation. And to all the audience, please remember that this book is for sale at the Little Shop of Stories. There is a link in the chat box. We've also got a short survey. We'd really appreciate it if you could partake in the survey. This is for the Atlanta Science Festival survey. And if you do complete it, there's a chance to win a $15 gift card to DoorDash. And with that, thank you so much. And I think everyone's putting in their last comments to you, Dr. Grandin, too, to say thank you for speaking with us all. And we can't wait to see dive into this book and your future ones as well.
Well, it was just great to be here, at least on Zoom. And if we can just get kids outside observing and all of the things in outdoor science, there's nothing expensive in it. It doesn't cost anything to get out and observe stuff.
That's a great point. Yeah, all you need is paper and pencil and your eyes.
Need that and well, there's a bird feeder. You can make them a milk carton. I mean, or pine cone pine cone artwork. Artwork you make with things you find outside.
Fantastic, great, and there's so many great messages here for you.
Well, right. Thank you. It was really great. Really great talking to everybody.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Well, then I guess I'm going to sign off and thank everybody for coming.